Hello, my name is John Hunt. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Science and Technology at the Medical Device Innovation Consortium in Arlington, Virginia. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium is the first public-private partnership created to advance the medical device regulatory science for patient benefit. MDIC's Science of Patient Input program provides a venue for continued collaboration to advance the art and science of patient engagement in regulatory science, including advances in methodologies and tactical considerations for integrating the patient's perspective and preference in the design, clinical development, and regulatory review of innovative medical technologies. In developing this report, the Science of Patient Input Participation in Clinical Trials Working Group of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium evaluated a series of device trial characteristics, level of invasiveness, outcomes assessment, trial enrollment, and trial design, and prioritized them based upon their relevance for patient engagement. The report underscores that when done correctly, patient engagement in medical product development is neither superficial nor episodic. The most successful efforts to leverage patient insights are those that recognize the value of this work and have embedded it into their corporate culture. Ideally, this commitment to patient engagement is held by company leaders and incentivized throughout the workforce. The report encourages sponsors to take the time and make the effort to build relationships with patient groups and individual patients that are based on shared commitment to the effort, clear expectations, regular communications, and a common language about the project. And with that, I'd like to introduce the panel joining me today. First, I'd like to introduce Kevin Kwok, an active patient advocate in Parkinson's. Second, Wendy Selig, a consultant to MDIC, a member of the Working Group Committee for the Science of Patient Input, and a co-author of this report. And finally, Mike Kotleski, who is the Working Group Chair for MDIC for the Science of Patient Input. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Kwok for his comments.
Thank you, John. Unmet need is an everyday word used in therapeutic development, but defining unmet need has historically not involved direct patient interaction, but rather through third-party agents of these patients. These indirect sources include physicians, researchers, and even patient advocacy groups themselves. I'm very often surprised, though, how many of these developers of the new medical unmet need have actually never met a patient. So what is true patient preference? Medical devices are often more invasive than medications. And with this invasiveness comes a greater clinical benefit versus risk consideration for patients. Before embarking on a very expensive clinical development track, wouldn't understanding what we patients need or value make sense? The third part to think about from the patient perspective is what are the endpoints that really matter to patients? Historically, medical devices and pharmaceutical developers use development endpoints that can get their product approved through regulators. But these endpoints sometimes cannot be translated to clinical benefit that are meaningful. Patients can help identify what these endpoints that matter really make sense. How often do we actually start a clinical trial only to find that they cannot enroll the target patient group? Patients and caregiver input might identify barriers that actually impact accrual or prevent dropout. While it may actually take more time in advance to get this information, we're often told that we don't have time to do these type of patient engagement assessments. It actually ends up costing developers more time at the end. Regulators are also now requiring metrics for their staffs to engage in the patient populations And so wouldn't it make sense for developers to also have firsthand conversations with patients? So in conclusion, I'd like to just say that as medical device companies strive to become more patient-centric, it only makes sense that they interact more with patients. This is a top-down cultural change that has to come from top-down and bottom-up. And only in doing so will we actually change the way patient engagement will occur. So Wendy, I'd like to now turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, John and Mike, and the entire MDIC team for involving me in this work. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how this report came together and some key elements of the report. To inform development of this work, MDIC undertook two important projects: a broad landscape review of existing materials, literature, and resources focused on generating patient insights for clinical trials, and surveys of device patients, industry stakeholders, and trial investigators to assess potential benefit for and use of patient engagement strategies for clinical trials. Those materials are available on MDIC's website and referenced in this report. To ensure that our work could leverage the significant resources already available on engaging patient input in clinical trials from the drug development arena, while applying those best practice approaches to medical devices, the SPI Steering Committee and the Participation in Clinical Trials Working Group identified and focused on promoting patient engagement activities related to aspects of product development that are unique to medical devices. The report includes a useful table that provides detail about key categories within clinical development for medical devices, including elements of level of invasiveness, elements of outcomes assessment, elements of trial enrollment, and elements of trial design. We have connected each of these categories to illustrative patient engagement objectives to provide sponsors and other stakeholders with some examples of how and why patient engagement around these aspects would be productive. 4 specific aspects are described in the report in greater detail and include the key topics of invasive procedures, reversibility, reporting side effects and symptoms, and placebo or sham procedure. We provide examples throughout the report of why and how these aspects of medical device trials create unique opportunities and imperatives for engaging patient insights. For example, a key distinction for certain categories of device trials when compared with most drug studies may be the requirement for patients to undergo an invasive procedure or procedures. Additionally, devices that are implanted have a more permanent impact on the patient. There are also key considerations to address regarding the frequent practice in clinical studies of using placebo, also known as a sham procedure in the device world. In certain device trials where a procedure is required to implant a device, there are additional issues, both practical and ethical, involved with designing a trial that will accurately measure the impact of the novel intervention. Patients who are randomized to control may either have no procedure and would thereby know they were on the control, or they might undergo some type of sham procedure to maintain the blinding of the study. Patients may be highly resistant to this possibility, and patient input can be very helpful as sponsors consider the best approach to addressing all of these topics. I'd now like to turn it over to Mike for some considerations for industry. Mike?
Thank you, Wendy. Our goal was to compile tools and information to make it easier for manufacturers and sponsors to prioritize patient input and get patients involved in the development of their devices and their clinical studies. Clinical studies that better reflect the priorities of patients they serve will be studies that enroll better, have better compliance, have better quality data, and have results that actually represent the outcomes that matter to the patients. There's a figure from the report that shows some ways in which patients may be involved throughout the development process. First, the sponsor needs to define their specific objectives for obtaining patient input and how it will be used. This will impact the timing and the methods used to elicit the feedback from the patients. For example, as Kevin discussed, patient feedback may be used to ensure the device meets an unmet need, ensure the device reflects patient preferences, to select clinical study endpoints that represent real patient priorities, to address barriers to patient accrual and retention in the clinical studies, and to generate patient preference information that could be used in regulatory submissions and discussions with regulators, or to leverage patient insights for post-approval activities. Sponsors also need to consider their organizational capacity for engaging with patients, such as securing internal support from the company leaders, accessing the necessary resources to do the work, providing adequate training for those who will be communicating with patients directly, and properly addressing the legal and compliance considerations that come along with that. Finally, sponsors need to consider the nuts and bolts of how to accomplish this. They need to determine what roles they want for their patient partners, and then how to identify and contact the appropriate type of patient. They should consider how the patient input will be implemented and how often the feedback will be sought. Experience has shown that best results come from systematic engagement over time rather than something like a one-off survey. This also allows for the company to build a trusted relationship with the patient partners and obtain better and maybe more candid input. In addition to the input into the development process, patients have shown an interest in working with study results as well. They can have a substantial role in interpreting the study findings and disseminating the conclusions to the broader patient community once the studies are complete. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to John for some concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Mike. As the field of patient engagement in clinical studies for devices evolves and expands, additional efforts could be undertaken by a variety of stakeholders to support sponsors, including the following: development of device company trainings, development of case studies of successful activities in device trials, pursuit of projects to capture learnings and measure impact for the field. And we could conduct a follow-up survey of device manufacturers to compare with our baseline results from the 2018 survey. And finally, I'd just like to thank the panel for their participation today, Kevin, Wendy, and Mike. And if you require additional information, you can locate that on our website at mdic.org, or you can email us directly at this specific email address, spy@mdic.org. Thank you very much.